The security guard at the Family Feud studio almost didn't let them in. Michael Rodriguez stood at the entrance with his 3 children, their clothes clean but obviously worn, carrying everything they owned in 2 plastic grocery bags. The guard looked at his clipboard, then back at the family, uncertainty written across his face. But when he saw the official invitation letter that Michael clutched like a lifeline, he stepped aside and let them pass into a world that felt impossibly far from the reality they'd been living for the past 6 months. Michael had never imagined he'd be here. 6 months ago, he'd been an assistant manager at a downtown auto parts store, living in a modest apartment with his kids, getting by. Not wealthy, but stable, secure. Then the store closed without warning, his savings evaporated during 3 months of unemployment, and the eviction notice that followed felt like the end of everything he'd worked to build. Now they lived in his 2003 Honda Civic, rotating between different parking lots each night so they wouldn't get moved along by police. The kids, Sophia, 12, Miguel, 8, and little Anna, 6, had adapted with the resilience that children somehow possess, turning their nightly car arrangements into an adventure, taking turns choosing which fast food parking lot had the best lighting for homework. The Family Feud audition had happened during one of Michael's better days, 3 months ago, when he still believed their situation was temporary. The kids had begged him to try out, insisting that their family was funny enough, smart enough, close enough to win, and somehow, miraculously, they'd been selected. Standing in the studio now, surrounded by bright lights and the buzz of television production, Michael felt the weight of maintaining the illusion that everything was okay. His children deserved this moment of joy, this escape from their daily reality of deciding which bathroom to use for getting ready in the morning, and which corner of which parking lot felt safest for the night. Steve Harvey bounded onto the stage during rehearsal, his energy immediately filling the space. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Michael used to make in a month, but there was nothing distant about his warmth. He moved through the families with genuine interest, learning names, making connections, setting everyone at ease. "And we've got the Rodriguez family from California," Steve announced, approaching their rehearsal podium. "Michael, you're the team captain. Tell me about your crew here." Michael straightened his shoulders, summoning the confidence he'd once carried naturally. "These are my kids, Steve. Sophia's my strategist, Miguel's got the quick answers, and Anna here is our secret weapon. She thinks differently than the rest of us." Steve knelt down to Anna's level, and she beamed at him with the fearless joy of a 6-year-old who hadn't yet learned that life could be anything other than an adventure. "Secret weapon, huh?" Steve grinned. "What makes you so special, little lady?" "I notice things," Anna said seriously. "Like how you make everyone smile even when they're nervous." Steve's expression softened, caught off guard by the observation. "You do notice things, don't you?" During the rehearsal, the Rodriguez family performed well. Their chemistry was natural, their answers creative, and Steve found himself genuinely enjoying their energy. What he didn't know was that this hour of normalcy, of pretending to be just another family competing for prize money, was the most stable ground Michael's children had stood on in months. The actual taping began with typical Family Feud energy. The Rodriguez family faced the Henderson family from Georgia, and the competition was spirited, but friendly. Steve worked his magic, drawing laughs and creating moments of connection that made great television. Michael surprised himself with how naturally he fell back into the role of confident father and team leader. For the first time in months, he felt like the man he used to be instead of the man circumstances had forced him to become. His children played alongside him with pure joy, and for precious minutes at a time, Michael could almost forget about the grocery bags containing their possessions, about the gas gauge that stayed perpetually near empty, about the constant low-level anxiety of not knowing where they'd be safe tomorrow night. The game remained close through 3 rounds. Both families were playing well, and Steve was clearly enjoying the back and forth between 2 groups who genuinely seemed to like each other. During the commercial break, Steve chatted casually with both families, his warmth putting everyone at ease. But everything changed during the 4th round. The questions seemed innocent enough, the kind of survey prompt that usually generated funny, relatable answers that made for good television. "Name something that makes a house feel like home." Steve announced with his characteristic enthusiasm. It was Michael's turn at the podium. He stepped forward, the studio lights catching the careful way he'd combed his hair that morning, using the McDonald's bathroom mirror, the way he'd made sure his shirt was tucked in, and his children looked as presentable as possible. Steve repeated the question, "Name something that makes a house feel like home." Michael opened his mouth to give a standard answer. Family pictures, maybe, or home-cooked meals. Safe answers that would land somewhere on the board and keep the game moving. But something about the word house hit him wrong. Something about the assumption embedded in the question that everyone in the audience, everyone watching at home, everyone standing on this stage had a house that could be made to feel like home. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Steve noticed, his smile faltering slightly as he sensed something shifting in Michael's demeanor. "Take your time," Steve encouraged gently. Michael looked at his children, standing at the family podium, still believing in him, still trusting that he could provide answers, could make things work, could be the father they needed him to be. And in that moment, the weight of carrying their secret, of pretending everything was fine, became too much. "We don't have a house," Michael said quietly. The words weren't meant for the microphone, weren't meant for the studio audience. They were barely meant to be spoken at all. But the studio acoustics picked them up clearly, carrying his confession across the space like a physical thing. Steve's smile vanished completely. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Michael looked directly into Steve's eyes, and something cracked open inside his chest. The carefully maintained facade, the protection he'd built around his children's innocence, the pretense that this was all temporary and manageable, crumbled. "We don't have a house," he repeated, louder this time. "We haven't had one for 6 months. We live in our car." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. The studio fell silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline, but the heavy silence of 300 people collectively holding their breath as they processed what they'd just heard. Steve set his cards down on his podium, not dropped them in shock, but placed them deliberately, like he was making space for something more important than the game. He walked around the podium and approached Michael, who stood frozen at the buzzer, realizing that he'd just shattered the illusion his children had been living in, had exposed their situation to hundreds of strangers and eventually millions of viewers. "Michael," Steve said softly, his voice stripped of all performance. "Look at me." Michael raised his eyes, expecting judgment, expecting the kind of pitying look that had become familiar from social workers and shelter administrators. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected: recognition, understanding, respect. "How long?" Steve asked. Simply. 6 months, Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost my job, lost the apartment. We've been staying in the car, moving around, trying to keep them in the same school district." Steve nodded slowly, processing not just the information but the enormous weight Michael had been carrying. He turned slightly toward Michael's children, who were staring at their father with wide eyes, beginning to understand that something significant was happening. "Kids," Steve said, his voice gentle but carrying clearly across the studio. "Come here." Sophia, Miguel, and Anna left the family podium and walked toward their father and Steve. There was something different in their movements now, a cautiousness that hadn't been there during the game, as if they were beginning to understand that their carefully constructed normal had just been exposed. Steve knelt down so he was at eye level with all 3 children, then looked up at Michael. "You know what I'm hearing?" Steve said, loud enough for the studio audience to catch every word. "I'm hearing about a father who's been keeping his children safe, keeping them in school, keeping them together as a family for 6 months. I'm hearing about a man who brought his kids to a game show and made them feel like they were on the greatest adventure of their lives." He stood up, facing Michael directly. "What I'm not hearing is giving up. What I'm not hearing is failure. What I'm hearing is love." The audience began to react, not with applause yet, but with small sounds of recognition, of understanding, of people connecting with a reality they'd perhaps feared for themselves or recognized in their own lives. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, but instead of the business card he usually offered, he did something unprecedented. He made a phone call, right there on stage, in front of everyone. Marcus? Steve said into the phone, his voice carrying across the studio through his microphone. It's Steve Harvey. I'm standing here with a family that needs our help. And I need you to clear your schedule for tomorrow morning. He paused, listening, then continued. A father and 3 kids. They're strong, they're together, and they need a chance to rebuild. Can you make it happen? Good. I'll send you the details. Steve hung up and looked at Michael with an expression that was part compassion, part determination. That was my friend Marcus. He runs a construction company, and tomorrow morning you're going to start working for him. Full-time. Benefits. Good pay. But first, Steve began removing his suit jacket, the same gesture that had become his signature in moments when the show transcended entertainment and became ministry. This jacket, Steve said, as he draped it around Michael's shoulders, has been with me through thousands of shows, thousands of moments when people needed something to hold on to. Now it's going to be with you while you rebuild. The weight of the jacket on his shoulders seemed to restore something in Michael's posture. Not false confidence, but real strength, the kind that comes from knowing you're not carrying your burden alone anymore. Steve, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion he'd been holding back for months. I don't know how to thank you. You don't thank me, Steve replied firmly. You show your kids what it looks like when a good man gets a second chance and does something beautiful with it. Steve turned to address the studio audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. This is what Family Feud is really about. Not the points on the board, not the prize money, but the reminder that we're all family. That when someone needs help, we show up. He looked at the Henderson family, still standing at their podium, and they immediately understood what he was asking. Rodriguez family and Henderson family, Steve continued, you're both winners today. Because today, we learned something more important than any survey could teach us. We learned what home really means. Steve gestured toward Michael and his children, now gathered together under the studio lights that seemed warmer somehow. More welcoming. Home isn't a place, Steve said. Home is where love lives. And this family, he pointed to Michael, Sophia, Miguel and Anna, they'd been carrying their home with them everywhere they go. The applause that followed wasn't the usual game show celebration. It was something deeper, something that acknowledged the courage it had taken for Michael to tell his truth, and the grace with which Steve had met that truth with action, instead of empty sympathy. But Steve wasn't finished. Michael, he said, I want to tell you something. 6 months ago, you thought you lost everything. But what you really did was discover what you could never lose. You discovered that you're the kind of father who keeps his family together no matter what. You discovered that you're raising children who can find joy and adventure even in the hardest circumstances. You discovered that love is stronger than any situation you might face. Steve paused, looking directly into the camera that would eventually broadcast this moment to millions of viewers. And everyone watching at home needs to understand something. This family didn't end up in their car because Michael failed. They ended up in their car because sometimes life is hard and unpredictable and unfair. But they stayed together, stayed hopeful, stayed human. That's not failure, that's triumph. 6 months later, Michael Rodriguez called Steve Harvey from the front porch of his new house. Not a mansion, not a palace, but a 3-bedroom rental with a yard where his children could play and rooms where they could close doors and feel safe and private and normal. Steve, Michael said, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been in over a year. We're home. The job with Marcus's construction company had led to steadier work, which had led to references, which had led to the kind of employment that came with health insurance and vacation days, and the radical luxury of being able to plan more than one day ahead. Sophia had joined the Honor Society at school. Miguel had started playing Little League. Anna had enrolled in art classes and spent her afternoons drawing pictures of houses, always houses, with specific attention to details like doorknobs and window boxes and front steps where families could sit together. Steve still has the picture Anna drew of him standing next to their family in front of their new house, all of them wearing oversized suit jackets and enormous smiles. The episode, when it aired, generated more viewer response than any in Family Feud history. Not just sympathy, but action. Families across the country began volunteering at homeless shelters, donating to job training programs, and most importantly, looking at homelessness not as an abstract social problem, but as something that could happen to anyone, something that required community response rather than individual judgment. Michael kept Steve's jacket hanging in the front hallway of their new house. Not as a decoration, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes help comes from unexpected places, that honesty can be its own form of courage, and that the distance between having everything and having nothing is often smaller than we think. But so is the distance between having nothing and having enough. Steve Harvey learned something that day too. He learned that the most powerful thing he could do wasn't make people laugh, though that mattered. It wasn't even inspire them, though that was important. The most powerful thing he could do was see someone who was carrying too much weight alone and decide to help carry it. Because that's what home really means. Not a place where you keep your things, but a feeling that you're not alone in the world, that someone sees your struggle and your strength and chooses to remind you that both are worthy of respect. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because sometimes the most important question isn't what makes a house feel like home. Sometimes the most important question is how we respond when someone tells us they don't have a house at all.